Our first speaker is James Peyer from Cambrian, and he's here in person.
So hey everyone, I'm James Peyer. I run a company called Cambrian Bio that some of you may have heard about, some of you may not have. It has been an awesome week here in Copenhagen. Morten, this is my first time here, actually, and for those of you out in the internet who chose or were not able to come, next year, try to make it. Copenhagen is beautiful, the conference has been fun, and this is where, I don't know, the best parts of the conference happen in person. So make it out next year if you can, and Morten, Daniela, Alex out there, thanks for having me in. So, many of you guys may have heard me give a talk like this before. I've been doing this for quite a few years now as the industry has been developing. And I think for much of the past 5 or 6 years, my main job has been to stand at the front of a room and pound on the table and scream something about how we need to use stepping stone indications and not go straight into building companies that are treating aging directly and do something else first. And I think that anyone who's been paying attention to this conference realizes, as I've realized, I don't need to do that anymore. The industry as a whole, I think, has really embraced this idea that we are all going to go for existing indications through existing FDA regulatory paths as a first stop towards eventually approaching treating the risk of getting diseases, right? Creating drugs that can reduce multimorbidity risk as a next step after that. And so what I wanted to spend today doing is actually bringing up maybe 2 more interesting issues, since I'm not going to be pounding on the table screaming about that. The first one I want to talk about is what is this industry actually going to be doing? What is the longevity therapeutics industry? And then secondly, talk a little bit about the distributed development company, which is the type of company that Cambrian is, and why I think that might be important as the industry gets shaped. So let's start in, and I'll just race through the beginning because we've seen variations of my first 2 slides a million times. Right, I think that we all know that there are a bunch of different ways of extending lifespan in mice, and that we all want humans to be next. And I think we also all agree that age-related diseases are caused by a gradual buildup of damage. And right now, we are treating people only after a disease has erupted into their systems, causing major havoc. But we want to get to a point where we're using the power of medicine to treat people who are in the damage building up phase of their disease, not the damage disrupting their physiology phase of the disease. And so, if that's what we're here to do, then I would like to propose a very, very general map of what this industry is going to be doing. And I've mapped this out over 3 decades with 4, I think, fundamental goals for what the longevity industry needs to do. And let's start with the 2010s. Discover longevity drugs and pathways. And I think that many of the people in this room have contributed enormously to this over the last decade and even a little bit longer. If you look at João Pedro's drug age and gen age database, we have more than 75 different interventions that can extend the median and or maximum lifespan of mice. So we now have this pool of breakthroughs that have been made. And in the 2020s, I think we find ourselves with 2 really fundamental goals to enable this field to happen that are going to have to run in parallel. The first is to demonstrate human safety and efficacy for these putative interventions, right? And this is the stepping stone indication that we talked about before. How do we take these drugs that have the potential to extend healthy human life and show that they are safe and effective at treating some disease in an existing regulatory framework in humans? But then the third goal that I think also has to be pursued this decade, that we've talked a lot about, especially today, but it's been peppered in throughout the whole conference, is develop clinical biomarkers for MMR. And MMR to me is multi-morbidity risk. So I never like to say chronological age or develop biomarkers of aging, because that shuts off any conversation you can have with the FDA or regulators almost right away. But you can have conversations about reduction in risk of heart disease, reduction in risk of stroke. Like, So if we just say reduction in risk of multiple morbidities, that immediately becomes a regulatory conversation that you can actually have. So I always refer to this as biomarkers for multi-morbidity risk. And the aging clocks is going to be one part of it, but I want to talk a little bit more on why this piece of the work this decade is so fundamental towards making the field work. And then as those two work streams kind of come together, you have clinical biomarkers for MMR, and you have safe and effective drugs that are getting approved for their own indications, then you can achieve the fourth goal of the longevity therapeutics industry, approving the first medicines to actually extend health span. And I've put this thing in the 2030s. It may come sooner. I hope it comes sooner, but we'll see. So let's talk first a little bit about biomarkers and why they're so important, and a little bit of like what we mean when we talk about biomarkers. My view is that establishing these biomarkers are actually key to turning this longevity biotech thing that we're all doing together into its own industry, instead of just being a little subsection of biotech. And that once this happens, that this longevity biotech industry will eclipse the entirety of modern pharma. So 5 quick points on these biomarkers. I think in order to get longevity therapeutics approved, those therapies are going to follow the path of statins, which many of you guys already know this analogy. I actually first heard it from Tom Rando when I was getting into the field, that he said, oh, well, statins are really the first highly imperfect anti-aging drugs because it's a risk biomarker, high cholesterol, and then you have a prophylactic medicine that you're using to treat that risk biomarker. And so I think we have to use that framework to understand how future longevity therapeutics are going to make it into people. Second, we have to acknowledge that a biomarker has not been validated, but the science is maturing incredibly quickly. We heard from a lot of different folks today. We have all these different aging clocks to choose from, and the question is, how do you assemble all of that work into a data set that can convince the FDA to allow us to do a short-term clinical trial? So third point, a group with a long-term vision needs to run a ton of different placebo-controlled clinical trials with multiple different longevity drugs, collecting the exact same biomarkers in every case in order to assemble that data set to present to the FDA or other regulators to allow us to do those abbreviated trials. Number 4, combining this data with correlational sources using artificial intelligence, algorithm-based approaches, that's what's going to ultimately give us that composite biomarker of multimorbidity risk. So all of these individual clocks that we have, we're going to have to pool all of this data together, find out which ones lead to the greatest predictive power of multimorbidity risk, combine those into a composite biomarker, and then go to the FDA. That framework, I think, is how at least I and the group at Cambrian is seeing this inflection point somewhere on the horizon. And so once you achieve those 4 things, with clinical trials achievable for healthy normals changing MMR, that could be done in 2 to 3 years instead of 7 to 15, we'll see new single agent and combination longevity studies that will usher in this next chapter of human medicine. So that's my kind of like biomarker manifesto in a way. That's the first part of what I wanted to kind of put forward. So this seems like a decent time to actually introduce Cambrian and what it is, because I haven't mentioned us yet. So Cambrian is what I call a distributed biotech company, and we're developing a wide pipeline of new medicines targeting the causes of aging and age-related diseases. And so we've formed partnerships with more than a dozen institutions and scientists at those institutions around the world that have made fundamental breakthroughs in geroscience, and then we pair them with our in-house R&D groups, venture groups, and an operations team to bring those breakthroughs to patients. But I'm not actually going to spend a ton of time on Cambrian today, except to say that the way that we look at the science of aging is through a very fundamental lens, which is adapted actually from Robert Koch. So Koch came up with 3 postulates in his work on infectious disease. And this is quite a while ago. And we've adopted those 3 postulates to look at the biology of aging. So every one of Cambrian's therapies that comes into our pipeline has to meet 3 criteria. Number 1, does it change for the worse as we age? Number 2, if you add it in, does it accelerate the onset of an aging disease? And number 3, when you remove that factor, does it slow or reverse age-related decline? And we've used this to generate a list of 13 different focus areas that are not designed to be exhaustive in the way that the hallmarks of aging are, but instead dynamic areas of active exploration where we think you can build new therapies. So this is just a snapshot of our pipeline. So these are 14 different drugs with partnered with different institutions. And the only thing that I will mention here is we like best to talk with folks that have already achieved in vivo proof of concept with at least a tool compound. And so 12 out of our 14 programs have already gotten in vivo proof of concept in mice. And now we're optimizing those compounds. You redo that in vivo experiment with the compound that will ultimately go into humans and then advance it into clinical trials. So then I want to talk about a second topic, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of time for discussion afterwards. So the second topic is about the lifespan of longevity companies. Because if we are doing a really good job leaning into this idea of going through stepping stone indications with all of these fundamental breakthroughs in geroscience, and it is true that each one of these companies that is part of longevity biotech can be a massively valuable orphan drug disease company or oncology company or metabolic disease company in its own right. The problem isn't the pathway of these companies going to be to shift towards the short term instead of prioritizing the long term. And so I have this slide on the screen, but I wish I could close it because this is not relevant yet to this point. But I wanted to lead into the second part that in order to achieve the dream of what I think of as this longevity therapeutics industry, you have to have a company which is structured in a way that the business can achieve both of these parallel work streams simultaneously. Right? So I talked about getting the safety and efficacy around the first regulatory indications that you would go into, but then also justifying this long-term investment to build the foundation for this MMR biomarker. And the reality is that most longevity companies today, they are going to be bought by a pharma company, and their investors are going to want to sell all of their shares long before that second thing happens. So the question that I've asked myself is, how can you build an organization that can take not just a 5-year view on developing a drug from a breakthrough status in the university, but take a 15 or a 20-year view so that we can get not just the first indication onto the market, but play a key role in leading to the geroscience applications as well. And this is my answer to that question, the distributed development company, which is a new way of organizing a business to develop drugs, and that has kind of emerged onto the biotech and pharma scene over the last, I would say, 6 or 7 years. And it comes from a very simple principle, or actually it comes from 3 simple principles, and I won't go through the graph here in the interest of time. Principle number 1, most scientific breakthroughs create assets and not platforms. So an asset meaning one interesting hypothesis that's worth testing in preclinical and eventually clinical setting, but not a technological platform that will spawn an unlimited number of future drugs, right? An example of a platform would be like Moderna, right? You have mRNA technology that can spawn almost any number of drugs. Most scientific breakthroughs don't look like that, but that doesn't mean that they're less worthy or less valuable. So the idea of a disco is to efficiently collect and develop the breakthroughs from those scientists that lead to these assets. Number 2 is that most investors hate taking binary risks where their money will either go to a large number or 0. Instead, investors much prefer an investment vehicle where you have a predictable, hopefully good rate of return, but the chance of it all going to zero is very, very low. And that's what the graph on the left actually shows, is that if you have 14 different drug development programs, which is what Cambrian has today, you have a greater than 95% chance of having one thing actually succeed, even if you're only batting at like pharma industry averages for drug approvals, which aren't particularly good. And then the more programs that you have in-house and the more you can resource them, the higher all of those chances go up. And then the third point is that discos can be much longer term than VCs or biotechs because they're designed to eventually go public and sit on a public market just like one of the big pharma companies do. But they're structured to be much more devoted to early stage research and development than modern day pharma companies are. So that's kind of like an overview of why I like this model. And I only have a couple more slides. I think we're going to skip this one. This is just like how these discos work, that it's not a technology platform at the core of a disco. It's actually a set of processes, right? Building a robust pipeline by taking assets into the disco, setting a strategy and defining killer experiments that either advance or, in some cases, shut down a program. Working closely with academics to execute on R&D programs, spinning that cycle over and over again, redefining the new experiments after you get data, executing on them until you're ready for commercializing a project. And then last slide, and we'll go to some questions, just to kind of summarize here. One of the things that I love about sitting in the seat that I sit in now with Cambrian is that we can combine a highly operational focus with this long-term mission and really mean it. So I think the traits that set Cambrian apart from a lot of other institutions that I've worked with in this field is that we can build a ton of different drugs targeting diverse pathways that play a role in aging and have the resources to fully support them. And we can also lay the foundation for this preemptive medicine trials while at the same time building a major biotech company and not skimp on all of this biomarker work. Really start investing in it today, which is what we're doing. And then third, we can have the scale and structure to truly think long-term because we're going to be around hopefully for 15 or 20 years if we're successful, continually investing in new early-stage programs in geroscience. So hopefully that was a useful introduction. I would love to take some questions and maybe talk about these two points that I brought up. And thanks again, everyone, for having me along.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. We have a question here in the audience.
Yeah, great talk. It's a super interesting model. I have a question about kind of the long-term vision. You know, if the vision is to go public and you eventually kind of have more of a, shareholder obligation and, profit-driven responsibility, I guess, when you're a public company, how do you justify to not sell an asset that has a very, attractive offer when you're in that position?
So at the highest levels of public biotech companies, there is always an understanding that you have to evaluate each of the assets in your portfolio for what would we sell this asset at, what is the right price to sell this asset? You have to know what that number is. And if someone came along and we said, oh, hey, we value asset X at, let's say, $500 million for its first indication, and then we also think it's worth $500 million for the geroscience and aging indication. And we would tell our shareholders, we think this whole package is worth $1 billion. And if someone came along and said, oh, well, we want to pay you $2 billion, but just for the first part, or $2 billion for the whole thing, we might say yes. And that's a thing that we will be able to do on a case-by-case basis. But by structuring the company in such a way that we can follow and are willing to step up to the plate to follow each program through to commercialization and onwards to the geroscience approach, it gives us that other path. Because what I see is a lot of biotech companies get stuck by relying on the pharma acquisition. And when that is plan A, that's when things often don't go well. The strongest companies end up or have to prepare for standing on their own, and then if a partner comes along and says, hey, we can actually be a great development partner for this program and can achieve the company's financial and scientific and medical goals, that's when really great deals are formed.
Okay, and we have another question in the audience from Morten.
Really great question, great presentation. I'm sorry, I've been on that stage for
I'm sure
too
it's
long.
a really great question.
No, but I was thinking about your layers of targets. You have the molecular and I think cellular targets. As a sort of someone that comes more from the biological point, you know, I would imagine that the root cause would be always the most where the greatest potential is. What are your views on these things?
So there was a follow-up paper to the 2013, Louise Otin, Guido Kromer Hallmarks of Aging paper that actually created these layers, right? That started with epigenetic changes and DNA damage kind of at the top of a hierarchy that then cascaded down into all of the other hallmarks. And I think that is biologically interesting and probably also biologically true, but from a corporate development perspective is irrelevant. Because what really matters to me is what are the tractable pathways that we can grab onto that can affect aging in a systemic way that give us the greatest chance to get these first drugs approved. And so I take that much more pragmatic approach to like, what are the right first drugs that are gonna come into this field? And then, we can have a conversation about whether epigenetics or DNA damage is upstream of everything else or not. And I think that's what will work out in the next decade, as these drugs are approved.
Okay. Thank you very much again for joining us today.
Thank you, Daniela. Thanks, everyone.